Hello, everybody. Welcome to the afternoon session. Welcome back. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Janice Chen, who's going to talk to us about brain dynamics underlying memory for continuous natural events. Please join me in welcoming Janice.
Thank you for the invitation to this conference. I'm really excited to be here and hear some of the discussion between the different talks in this session. It's such a great topic. So I'm going to talk about memory for continuous natural events, both brain dynamics and behavior. Your memory is unique. The events that happen to you happen only to you in your life. And just remember that despite some of the things I'm going to say in the next hour, I really do think that you're unique. So in this talk, I'm going to discuss event perception and event memory, and also how inter-event structure can relate to memory. And in all of the studies, you'll notice that we try really hard to stick to a naturalistic style of experiment. So what do I mean by that? Well, in psychology, we often use very simplified stimuli and constrained task paradigms and randomized trial orders, and everyone understands the need for that, which is to isolate individual variables and to try to control compounds. And that can be a very elegant and successful way to do things, and it's the majority approach, and I think that it should be. But sometimes we also would like to study the way that things usually are in the ugly, messy weeds of the real world. And so we actually are interested in the confounds. We wouldn't call them confounds if we were studying them. We would call them correlation structure or co-occurrence. And I think that the co-occurrence structure of the natural world is a crucial object of study in its own right. And I would also argue that a lot of cognitive and neural phenomena are stronger and more tractable to study if you make the experiment a little bit more realistic. So with that perspective in mind, let's talk about event memory. So a popular idea in memory science is that when you remember a past event, your brain activity returns to the state that it was in at the time of the original event. So patterns are reactivated or reinstated, and that is literally how we remember stuff. And there's an intuitive appeal to this idea because remembering a past event is a lot like re-experiencing it or reliving it. So when we recall a past event, are brain patterns reactivated? The answer is yes, which we know from many experiments that kind of have this format where we ask participants to memorize a random word and a random picture that they go together, and later we show them one of those and ask them to retrieve the other. And then we compare brain patterns at the time of encoding to retrieval and ask if they're significantly similar. So where in the brain do we observe that? This is a much more interesting question, which I'm going to get to shortly. And then does it scale up to real life? So if I'm remembering my breakfast now, is that actually happening to me? Are brain patterns being reactivated? Is this effect so small that we really need to control every parameter in order to be able to detect it? Or is it robust enough that we actually will be able to see it if we let things be a little bit more messy and complicated? So this is the kind of experiment that we do. So we bring people to the scanner and we show them a movie for about an hour. And they have no task other than to lie there and watch the movie and pay attention to it. They know they're going to take some kind of memory test later, but they don't know what. And then we're going to record them speaking, both auditorily and to their brain activity while they're speaking about the movie. So I'm going to show you a clip. We use BBC's Sherlock for this. And that's about 50 minutes long.
What about these suicides then, Sherlock? Thought that'd be right up your street. 3 exactly the same.
4. There's been a 4th. There's something different this time.
A 4th?
Where?
Okay, this is a great stimulus. It's got a lot of drama, it's got a lot of scenes, it's got a lot of action. It actually became so popular that by the time we were running the second study, it was very hard to find people who hadn't seen it before at Princeton. But at this point, not that many people had seen it, and so everybody who watches this in this experiment has never seen it before. So then, immediately after watching it, the subjects are given instructions to try to recall the entire story in their own words, from start to finish. They're not going to receive any interaction or guidance from the experimenter during this time. They just start talking, and then they go until they say that they're done. And people spend a pretty long time doing this. So we ask them to try to go for 10 minutes, and they say, oh, that sounds like a long time. But then they end up talking for over half an hour often. So here's an example. And so this is actually a pretty typical level of recall that we see. And she's going to be recalling the clip that you just saw, which means that it's a solid half hour later at least.
So they have this exchange where Miss Hudson comes in, asks if everything looks okay, and she picks up the newspaper and she's asking Sherlock about the murders that have happened. And Sherlock briefly looks outside and he sees that there are cop cars, and he says that there's been a fourth murder and something must have been different, so that's why they're there. And just moments later, the chief walks in.
So the recall is very detailed and complete. We were surprised at how good it was, but it is the kind of thing that people have a lot of practice doing. You speak to other people about your memories all the time, and this is right after seeing the movie. So we were very pleased to get this rich recall. The way that we analyze the data is to split the movie into scenes or events, and this is done on human judgments. So you should please see another line of work from Chris Baldessano trying to find methods for data-driven methods for segmenting events based on the brain data. This is beautiful work, but in this study, we're going with human judgments for the scene rating. So basically boundaries where a lot of people agree that that's a major boundary. It's like suddenly the next day, or they leave the room, or something like that. Okay, we segment the movie into 50 scenes this way and give each one a label. And then during the recall, we go to each person's audio recording and find those same scenes and identify them. So now we have time point to time point matches between the movie and the recall. People don't remember every single scene, but it'll be around 30 scenes. And here's an example of the recall behavior. So on the x-axis, on the y-axis, you see this time during the movie, which is about 50 minutes. And then on the y-axis is this person's recall timeline. So he spends about 22 minutes describing the movie. And each box on this diagram is a scene in the movie. So what you can see is that the height of each box is the length during the movie, and the width is how long it takes for him to describe it. And a couple of things immediately. It's pretty complete, so he's actually hitting most of the scenes. It's pretty linear. It's in order, and they're instructed to try to do it in order. And it's actually kind of straight, so it means that the temporal compression that this person's applying to the recall is actually constant. And if you see boxes that are hanging off of the diagonal, it means that they're recalled out of order, which doesn't necessarily mean that the subject thinks that that's when it happened, but that's when they happen to mention it. Right? So sometimes they say things like, oh, I forgot to mention. And this is all of the subjects, 17 subjects. So you can see that their recalls span from about 10 minutes up to 45 minutes, which is almost the entire length of the original movie. And everybody kind of has the same pattern, relatively complete, not too much bowing, so there's something consistent going on, and we have this great data to work with. So the first analysis we're going to do is that reinstatement analysis. And even though everybody is doing something quite different, they're talking about the movie in their own words, and the amount of compression they're doing is different, and the actual things they're saying are different. That's okay, because we're going to be doing it within subject analysis, where we just say, whatever your brain activity was like when you were watching the movie, does that pattern of activity reappear when you talk about the movie? And we'll do that separately for each person. So the method is like this. For the purposes of this analysis, we just average across an entire movie scene. So we take all of the little things that are going on, we just make one pattern of activity for them. And the same for every scene as it's recalled along those same event boundaries. And then for every scene in the movie that the person recalls, we just calculate a correlation between the movie and the recall. And our baseline here is going to be the correlation between random scene pairs. So in order to pass this test and appear in the map, the scenes have to be discriminable from each other. So every scene has a different fingerprint of activity from another scene. At maximum, it's every single scene is totally distinguishable from other scenes. Below threshold, they wouldn't be, and so the reality is somewhere in the middle. Now we might ask, where would we expect to see reactivation in a task like this? One idea about where to see it is where you find it with those simpler paradigms. So this is what's called the core recollection network, areas that appear in reinstatement tasks and also vary in their strength with the strength of the memory. You have your usual suspects of posterior cingulate, angular gyrus, perihippocampoid cortex, medial prefrontal cortex. This network is pretty similar to the default mode network, so famous for being active when people are lying in the scanner doing nothing. And really, this network has just about 1 million names, and it seems to have a very wide variety of functions. So just to highlight a few that are relevant for this talk, active during recollection and autobiographical memory. It seems to integrate information over long time scales. It has intrinsically slow dynamics. And it often appears in these scene construction tasks and is thought to support information about situation models, which I will talk about a little bit more later. So I'll just put the results up. Where we see reactivation during this free spoken recall of events is throughout the default mode network, as well as some high-level visual areas. And so you see those same posterior medial cortex, medial PFC, angular gyrus, perihippocampoid cortex. And this is a strong, robust effect, actually. So I'll show you every individual subjects in posterior medial cortex, and you see positive reinstatement in every subject. And remember, it's not just similarity, they have to be distinct patterns for individual scenes. If you compare that to the image I showed earlier, you see a lot of overlap. So that's great that when we try to scale up the task to something more realistic, we still kind of get the same basic pattern of results. And I want to make it a little more interesting now. So we are distinct, unique individuals, but obviously we share a lot with each other as well. Even in the picture that I drew here, the memories are not totally different, right? There's some commonalities between what we remember, and so maybe we should look for that. So just to illustrate, here's some examples of different people recalling the same event. And I'm not going to play the event, but I'll just tell you quickly. This is the first scene where you meet Sherlock. He's actually in a morgue looking at a cadaver. And then he starts to do really weird stuff. He takes out a riding crop and he's like whipping the body. There's this other person there who's kind of trying to flirt with him, and they have this weird interaction where it's not clear what he thinks, and then he kind of leaves her standing there confused. Okay? So here's what a couple of different people said about it. This person says, then he brings them to a morgue where Sherlock Holmes whips a dead body. I don't really know why. I guess he's wondering about the bruising pattern, making a forensic study. This person says, I'm not going to read everything, but in red, he's talking to a lab technician who has a crush on him, and he doesn't pick up on her cues. So the first person actually forgot or didn't think it was worth saying that there was another character in that scene. This person remembers and also tries to kind of describe the interaction that they had a little bit. And this person has a lot more to say about the scene, but in red, she's clearly trying to ask him out, and he hardcore rejects her. And then she asks if he wants to get coffee later, and he's like, yeah, black 1 sugar, which is a kind of sarcastic response. This is a different interpretation of the interaction that these two characters have. So you can see that what they remember, or at least what they choose to report, can be pretty different. And the actual words that they're saying, of course, are totally different. But there are some similarities in what these people report as well, right? So everybody mentions where that scene is. Everybody mentions that Sherlock is there, and at least, and what he's doing, and even why he is doing that. They take a guess at it. And then these two people remember the other character as well, and her kind of dynamic with Sherlock. So what you're seeing here, I think, are the elements of the situation model. This is an older idea in the psych literature, recently kind of getting new attention in the neuroscience literature, largely in part to Charan's very beautiful review on it. So situation models is just paraphrasing him. Situation models specify the gist of the spatial, temporal, and causal relationships that apply within a particular context. The relationships between entities, actions, and outcomes. So the way I think of it is what makes one scene different from the next, what's making a person decide that there is a new event happening. They're looking at the contingencies between all of the elements, all of these elements in a scene, and saying, this is a different scene. And even subtle differences may make a difference here. So this is going to give us some hope that if we compare recall activity between people, we might find some similarity. So now we're taking the same approach. We're now comparing between people during recall. And the analysis is also exactly the same. So there's no movie data involved here. Now it's just one person talking about a scene and another person talking about that same scene. But again, we have this baseline, which is the correlation between random scenes. So you might think about what will happen here. Maybe we're going to see that this intersubject recall similarity is going to be restricted to a subset of the areas that were present during reactivation, right? So some places are doing reactivation, and some places there's actually some convergence across people. Or it could be that you're going to get all of the same areas that you saw in the reactivation analysis, but kind of weaker. So it's a strong similarity to yourself in the past, and then a kind of partial similarity present in the signal between you and other people. Okay, here's the map. This is, again, pretty much the whole default network in some high-level visual regions. It looks very similar to the map we saw before. Pretty much throughout the same areas where we saw reactivation, we also see these similar patterns comparing between different people only when they're speaking about the same scene. And if you put the maps side by side, you can see the extent. Actually, similarity between people during recall was stronger than recall and movie in a lot of these areas. So there's the difference map of recall minus movie recall. And when I say a lot, I mean that depending on which comparison you make, 57% or 51% of the map is stronger for recall than movie recall, which is not what I said might happen a couple of slides ago. So what's going on? How can I be more similar to someone else than I am to myself? It doesn't seem to make any sense. But the reason is that we're talking about you in the past and you in the less distant past. You watching the movie and you remembering the movie. So I'm saying that you're more similar in some of these regions to somebody else remembering the movie than you are to yourself when you were watching the movie. So you can think about it this way. During perception, you have some pattern of activity. And then during recall, you may think, well, for each person, they remember it in a little bit of a different way. So you change, your recall pattern is kind of a changed version of the movie pattern, and everybody is different, and so there's a kind of idiosyncratic change for each person. But it might also be that everybody's memory is changing in the same way. So you have this systematic change where elements of the original pattern are lost or altered, and that alteration is the same for each person. So that's how your memory could be more similar to somebody else's than to the original experience. And think about why that actually makes complete sense. A memory system that records perception perfectly would really not be that useful. We need memories to be transformed from perception in order to benefit from them. So we need them to potentially be a bit compressed so that we're not spending our entire lives replaying our entire lives. We need to associate that information with existing knowledge and integrate it. And we need to be able to generalize to similar situations. And so we do actually find a behavioral benefit to this transformation where the amount of transformation in that pattern, the systematic transformation across people, predicts the likelihood of recall of any individual scene. Now you may be asking, well, maybe that's just dumb. So maybe subjects are more similar during recall because they're all talking, and during the movie they're doing something else, right? So here's a way to think about this. Remember that every pattern has to be discriminable from another. What we find is that discriminability between people, between scenes using the recall analysis is consistently higher than movie to recall. So let me unpack it. And this is a useful way of thinking about the analysis too. This is work with my postdoc, Lisa Muz, who has done amazing work on this stuff and also will be presenting her other amazing work tomorrow in a totally different project. We draw the data like this. So imagine that you take an individual pattern of activity and you plot it on an axis. So I have dimension X and dimension Y here and focus on the M dot, which is the movie pattern. And the dimension X and dimension Y could be voxel 1 and voxel 2 or voxel 3 and voxel 4, or some reduced dimension version of that space, right? So it's literally a way that you can visualize the data. It's not just a schematic. Then we think about the movie pattern as a latent pattern around which individual subjects may vary a little bit. So that could be noise, or it could be your kind of idiosyncratic interpretation of the movie. But what we find is that during movie viewing, actually people are pretty similar to each other. So if showing you the classification performance for individual scenes of a movie across people, chance level is 2% because you have 50 scenes, and we're getting close to 40% for this classification. People are very, very similar to each other during the movie. So if you have the movie pattern and then each person's recall pattern is kind of a degraded or idiosyncratically changed version of it, then you have these recall points, the R's, that kind of spread out. That is what it would look like if it was totally idiosyncratic change. Another kind of change that you could imagine is what we call a global change. So there's something happening at movie and there's something happening totally different at recall. People are speaking. And that's happening at every scene during recall. They're speaking during every scene. And so you have this change, this common shift that's applied to every scene, plus a little bit of the idiosyncratic noise. So here's something that could be happening and likely is happening. But this kind of shift doesn't increase discriminability of recall patterns from each other. And this, finally, is the scene-specific transformation. So you have a shift that is happening for every scene. People are moving in a common direction for every scene, but that direction is different for every scene. And that allows you to actually increase discriminability between recall scenes. And this is the pattern we see in 99% of the searchlights where we see transformation. Okay? So that's our answer to, is it just because everybody's talking about recall? I think that probably there is a global shift going on, but it's pretty hard to imagine that it could lead to a scene-specific shift. And I also find this a useful way to simulate the data. Okay, so what is the change that's happening? I just showed you where it is, and I talked about what might be the kind of vector-based description of it, but one obvious candidate for the type of change we're seeing is temporal compression, right? So I showed you that the original movie is 50 minutes long, and most people are compressing it to about half at least. And so we went to the language that people are producing when they're talking about their memories. We did this very careful coding, so we developed a new rubric for figuring out whether people are summarizing over a relatively long period of time or whether they're giving a precise kind of blow-by-blow description of what's happening. And often what will happen is when people start describing a new scene, they first give you a summary of what's to come, and then they go back and tell you each step at a time. So Lisa developed this rubric and validated it, you see things like this. So they'll summarize over an entire scene, maybe a whole minute of the movie into one sentence. And you also see a lot of very precise moment-by-moment descriptions. Here we just kind of arbitrarily said if the description of the event refers to something that's less than 10 seconds, we're going to call it precise. Okay? People also say a lot of other kinds of things that are kind of metacognitive or inferences that can't be tied to a specific moment in the scene. And you see that people spend most of their time doing precise description, and there's also a fair amount of summary statements. And now we just look in all of the regions where we observe transformation. And what we find is that in most of those regions, more summarization corresponds to more transformation. So it's this temporal compression of the memory that seems to be associated with more pattern change. I think that's great. So there are a lot of other things that I mentioned already, hypotheses for what other factors could be going into the transformation, and we're following that up. Okay, so I love using speech as a way to get people's memories because it's very natural, it's very easy for people, and they will go on and on. And I always believed that they only speak for so long because they know that somebody's listening, right? They know that I'm listening, even though nobody is saying anything to them. So a natural follow-up experiment here was to actually introduce listeners. So we take the recorded speech of somebody describing Sherlock, and then we play it to a new group of people who have never seen the movie. And the idea here is to see what kinds of brain activity are being elicited when people hear a description of something that they have never seen themselves. And this, of course, is a kind of transmission of information, transmission of somebody's memory to another person that allows them to construct the images and ideas that were present in the original movie. And so the analysis is to compare the naive listeners directly to people who are watching the original movie and get some evidence that they actually are thinking about those things. This is work by Ase Zabud. And what you see is similarity between the naive listeners and the movie viewers in all of those same default network regions. It's actually quite strong. There's an unpublished portion of this data set, which is people who have seen the movie then listening to the description. And they're really not that easy to distinguish from each other. That's the fact. So a lot of what we're measuring is either, it seems to be largely insensitive to whether you're actually remembering something or creating it from listening to another person's detailed description. And furthermore, we find that the degree to which the listeners match the movie viewers predicts their written comprehension following watching the movie, and this is replicated with a separate movie as well. So it's a nice result. And this kind of suite of studies together, I think, shows you the whole kind of cycle of things where you can have a common neural code between people used as a platform for communicating ideas. We use speech to elicit a copy of our own experience in other people, and that can be a mechanism for people to learn efficiently from the experiences of others, as Greg has written about very beautifully. And this efficient part of it is really important, right? Because when somebody tells you about something that they saw, you don't have the exact same original experience as they did. You get the benefit of their experience. So you actually use other people's brains as a kind of filter on the world. They get all of the original input, they turn it into something useful for you, and they give you that efficiently organized information. And that leads to civilization. Each of these steps is imperfect, partly because of noise and loss, and partly because of an optimal transformation that probably serves the purpose of either the deliverer or the listener. And so very interested in kind of detailing what these transformations, what the purpose of them may be. Okay, that's the summary of that first section. And we'll go right on to the next thing. So the world is continuously bombarding us with data, and we extract structure from the input stream and we store it. Or maybe we impose structure on the input stream. I'm not sure that those are different. Later we reconstruct the experience from memory, and maybe the structure is enhanced in the memory. So I think that the transformation analyses are kind of in line with this idea, but those really focus on the discriminability of individual events from each other, at least in the brain. And so our second question here is going to be about how the relationships between events may affect memory, because there is a lot of structure there. So these are relationships across time, and they can be quite convoluted when you're talking about something like a narrative. So here's an artist's depiction of some of the event structure in popular stories. So here, the way that he's drawn it is every line is a character in the story, and if they're grouped together, then it means that they're actually traveling together. And then over time, they may converge or diverge and split and come back together, and you see these different movies. And of course, psychologists have also attempted to do this kind of thing, and there's a very rich literature that I've only barely begun to start looking at, but there are many attempts to kind of understand story grammar and to design stories that have certain properties and look at how those properties affect memory. You know, we are going to use movies again, movies and stories. And we're going to take advantage of some of the newer tools available out in the ether to automatically extract some of this narrative structure. This is what we're going to try. So this is with a different data set. We have people watching 10 short movies. The total is still about an hour of data, and the movies vary from around 2 to 10 minutes. And I'll tell you about 2 different ways that we are trying to look at the narrative structure, one in terms of trajectories and one in terms of networks. And this is work with my amazing postdoc, Hong Mi Lee. So in Sherlock, remember we had this linear storyline. It pretty much makes sense. It pretty much goes in order, and people report it in order. In the what we call the film festival data, you have 10 different stories, and people will report each individual one in order. But they don't talk after every movie. They watch all 10 movies, and then they go. And so the recall behavior looks pretty different. They'll talk about each little movie on its own, and then they'll have to think of another one to talk about, and that could be anywhere. And so here I show you a bunch of different people. They do all kinds of different things. There are some patterns here, but people tend to talk about the first movie first or the last movie first. But it's not at all clear why people choose to go from one movie to the next, and this is an object of study for us. But not what I'm going to talk about primarily now. Just know that we have this pattern of data. So the way that we're going to look at structure is carefully annotate the movie. So we bring in multiple people to watch the movie and then the movies, and then write down a description of what's happening at every moment, down to the scale of about 5 seconds. So they segment the movie however they wish, and then write down what's happening, a couple of sentences. And so we have a lot of text that describes every event in the movie. And then we convert each annotated scene into a vector format using word or sentence embedding. And so the idea here, these tools are being developed in machine learning, but the idea is that you can take a word or a sentence and turn it into basically you've had an algorithm that has read all of Wikipedia or all of Google News, and it's able to create a lower dimensional space in which to put words or sentences that preserve some of their semantic relationships to each other. So these spaces are around 500 dimensions, and it means that if you have a word or a sentence that is similar to another word or a sentence, they're going to be close together in that multidimensional space. And not only that, you can kind of do algebra on these spaces. You can add different points together, and it still kind of works. So I wouldn't say it's like as good as having a person read it, but it is like amazingly good for an automatic tool. So for every segment, you can turn it into a vector of numbers. And then that means that you can plot it as a trajectory, right? So every one of these dimensions is now over here. It's a dimension on the axis, and so every point in time is point in this multidimensional space. That's a trajectory. And you can also think of it as a point-to-point time-time similarity matrix. So for every moment of all of these movies, this is a symmetric matrix, you can ask how similar it is to any other moment in the movie. And we validated this a little bit using human judgments. In order to collect human judgments at this scale, it would be kind of astronomical. But using this automatic approach, we can look at the inter-time similarity structure pretty quickly. And just to show you, I think that this is a good indication of the quality of the tool. If you take 3 independent annotators and have them do the entire annotation of the 10 movies and then look at their trajectories, they align extremely well. So you can't even really see that there are 3 different annotators here. There are 3 different colors of the black and gray. So there's good agreement across people. And now we can take the text-based trajectories and compare the movie and the recall. Right? So we have the same space for the movie and the recall, that 500-dimensional space. And looking at it in 2 dimensions, you have these 10 different movies. Each one is a different cluster of points, these colored points. And then you can go to each person's description from memory of that movie and turn it into the same space, right? So that means that I can draw this diagram for each person and recover the structure of the original 10 movies. Here, it's kind of hard to see that they're visiting the movies in a different order, right? You can show it as an animation, too. So here's a That's now the three-dimensional version of this, and you can show that people visit different parts. You can see that it kind of talks about red, and then talks about green, talks about blue, and another person might visit the parts of this space in a different order. And this kind of gives you a groundwork for asking questions about clustering and about density and about the speed with which they travel to these different spaces. I think it's going to be quite useful. The first thing that we're trying to do with it is match it to the trajectory of the bold activity. So bold activity also is just a vector of values, and so you could plot it as a trajectory in space as well. Every dimension is voxel. You know, we have the annotation trajectory, we have the brain trajectory. Of course, we try to align them. It works okay. You know, we get a sensible set of regions where you see this significant, I guess, alignment according to a randomization test. You know, default network regions as well as auditory and language regions. It doesn't seem to be very selective. And then the visualization of that in a lower dimensional space does not work that well all of the time. So I haven't decided yet whether that is a problem. Maybe the alignment just like isn't low dimensional, and so I can't view it in a low dimensional space. There is a lot of work to be done here, but I think that it's an interesting avenue. What we really want to do with it is that we have time points during the movie where people aren't saying anything because they're struggling to remember the movies. And I would really like to know what the activity dynamics are like when they're struggling and traveling around to this space looking for their memories. Okay, so the other approach that we're taking to looking at inter-event structure and narratives is with networks. So remember this correlation matrix, it's time, and every one of these black boxes is one of the 10 movies. So the color of the individual cells is telling you how strongly similar individual time points are to each other. That's why within the black lines you see relatively high similarity, because movies are kind of internally similar and less similar to other movies, just in terms of the words people use to describe them. And we're going to make a network out of this. So what you're seeing on the right is all 10 movies. The different colors of points correspond to the 10 different movies. And the way that we made this network is that every node in that network is an event from the narrative, from the movies. And every edge is the similarity between those two events. It's a little bit thresholded so you can see the shape of the network. So it means that you're seeing events that are connected to many other events, and even sometimes across movies, as well as events that are kind of isolated and not too similar to other events. And it probably makes more sense to look at this for each individual movie, so you can immediately see if there are parts to a movie. So in this first one, the very beginning of the movie has a couple of scenes which take place in a kind of game show, and then it flashes back to events that are happening at a prison in France. When there are distinct, semantically distinct events and clusters of events in a narrative, you'll see them in this structure. So it's useful just for that. But the hypothesis we had was that events that are more interconnected with other events are going to be the ones that are best recalled, partly because they have this kind of fan-like associative structure, so many other elements will point to them, and also because they're important. They link to a lot of other events. They're points at which perhaps a lot of information is coming together and making sense. And so we look at the centrality of each moving event. So this is the number of connections, or the strength of connections that each movie event has. And there we just highlight the top 3 and the bottom 3 for every one of the movies. And then we go to the recall transcript, and we ask, what's the probability for every individual event that people did mention it during their recall? Right? So we have some variability. Some events are remembered by everybody, some by nobody, and then all of this stuff in between. And now we're going to be able to ask what the relationship is between these two, between the connectedness of events to each other and the likelihood that they'll be recalled. So it's 2 ways to look at it. You can throw all the movies into one plot and just ask if there's any relationship, and there is. I'm not sure that that is really the right way to do it, because some movies are going to be intrinsically more memorable. All of the events might be more memorable, and so you probably should be looking at it one story at a time. And so on the right, we just take the top 40% and the bottom 40%, high centrality and low centrality in each of the 10 movies, and see whether we have that same pattern. So I find this result quite interesting, and we're preparing for a pre-register study with new movies and also written stories to run on MTurk. We do have a connection to the brain data as well here. So we can plot event centrality against the similarity between people's brain patterns while they're watching and remembering the movies, right? So again, this is the pattern similarity, event by event, scene by scene, for one story at a time. And we can ask if there's a relationship there where more connected events actually result in more synchrony across people. And then if we look for that in each of the 10 movies, then we can plot it like this. And we can show, so you're seeing RR is the correlation across people during recall, and MM is during movie. So you see this, it's not incredibly strong, but you do see a consistently positive relationship between event centrality and this inter-subject pattern similarity, and this is in posterior medial cortex. Okay, I'm almost done here. So despite all of this stuff, I really don't think similarity structures everything. They definitely had a lot of things right in trying to draw these storygrammars. And so we need to look at causality. Causality is really not that easy to automatically identify, so we have to do manual labeling for it. If we include causality in our models of brain activity, can we make better predictions? We are curious about online versus retrospective description too. We have these annotations of the movies, but they're made by people who have already seen the whole thing. And so in a way, they already know, the way that things turn out, and so they know which events are going to be important. Maybe they already know which events are central. And so what we would like to do is have people annotate the movie as they watch it for the first time, which is pretty labor intensive to stop the movie every 10 seconds and write something about it, but we're figuring out a way to make this happen. And a third avenue of exploration is the segmentation grain. I actually think this is going to be pretty important. So some of the work that I briefly mentioned at the very beginning is showing that different parts of the brain segment the movie differently and at different scales. And here we kind of allow people's we allow their judgments to guide the places that we segment. But if you ask a person to segment at a finer grain, they can do that too. And so I think we need to see how these different kinds of memory effects interact with the segmentation grain, and whether there are different kinds of memory that actually may correspond to larger grains of perception. Yeah. And finally, my thinking about using movies and narratives in these kinds of experiments has changed over time. And when I first started doing it, I thought, well, we would like to study a real experience, and the movie is about as close as we're going to get to that in the scanner. Okay, so the movie is like a proxy for real world experience. It has a lot of the natural statistics of the environment, and it has dynamic images and sound and real people. And then I thought, well, it's not very realistic actually. It's already highly temporally compressed. It's like crafted by experts to be engaging. So the movie is actually like a super stimulus. The brain is evolved to handle things at a much slower pace, the things that happen over multiple days, and then kind of turn that into some meaning. And so when we give it this hyper-compressed, like extremely exciting movie, it's like hyperdrive. And that's why we love them so much, and we idolize actors and actresses, and we pay like billions of dollars to make blockbusters. But then I changed my mind again. And then I thought that actually I think the brain, human beings are designed to consume narratives. Stories are old, evolutionarily so old. And being able to understand stories and communicate them to other people is, it's critical for communication and being with other people. And that means it's critical for survival. And so now I think that when we study how the brain processes movies and stories, we actually are studying something fundamental about its operation. So that's the summary of all the little things that I've told you, and just quickly have acknowledgments to all of the incredible people that contributed to this work, postdocs Lisa and Hongmi and Ren Chang on the original Sherlock work, and of course my former advisors and funders. Thanks.
Thanks very much. We have plenty of time for questions.
Thanks, that was great. I have two questions that both relate to the observation that you have greater matches between recall across people than perception recall. So the first question is about why perception recall you might be underestimating it. And it really relates to a point you made right near the end, which is the perception of a naive viewer of these, particularly if it's a film that's been done well, should have a lot of ambiguity in it that gets resolved as it goes on. So it should be different, right? That it should be different than the original perception if the filmmaker's done their job when you see it. So it seems like the fairer comparison would be the second or third time you've seen it. If you really want to get at what's abstracted away from perception to memory, because it should be different between perception 1 and perception 2, right? Because you now, and this is the point you were making, things that were ambiguous or not noteworthy, when you find out how things happen. And I was thinking, I don't know this show or this episode, but maybe as the episode went on, it became clearer that there was some flirtation going on. Maybe some of the subjects picked up on that initially and others didn't, but in the recall, they all kind of got it, at that point. So that has to do with why you might be underestimating.
That's exactly what I think is in the transformation effect, though, like that kind of interpretation that people are getting at the time that they're remembering.
But it's a little different than saying they just abstract away from the perceptions. They actually have a different meaning of it, right? So it's not, and then if you want to get just at the abstracting away, it seems like you really need to look at a non-naive viewer.
The abstracting away from the kind of perceptual details.
Yeah. Because there's two things going on. There's abstracting away, and there's also you would see it differently the second time. We've all had that experience. You see something a second time, you do see it differently. That's not a memory effect. That is a interpretation / perception effect. So
so watching something a second time is different.
Yes.
It's very different. And what we find is that people are a lot more similar to each other during first viewings than they are to themselves on the second viewing.
Yeah, that's just what...
Everybody changes in a different direction when you view it the second time, partly maybe because of some of it is boredom, and that stimulus is really designed to be seen the first time.
Right.
And it doesn't have the same control over people's brain activity the second time.
Yeah, so I just think it would be interesting to have those data, in these kind of data sets, because it might be that you then see a lot greater similarity between perception and memory. With regard to my question about something that might cause you to maybe overestimate is not the right word, but the recall effect, is that you didn't go into the details of how you do the cross-subject comparison, but presumably you have to do some kind of alignment of the searchlights.
We don't do anything beyond basic anatomical
registration. So it seems like one hypothesis that maybe would be hard to test with these sorts of data, but you could at least entertain, is that the parts of the brain that are where you get those kinds of correspondences, where you can do the cross-subject comparison at the level of bold searchlights, might be the areas that show more generalization, and areas that are doing more perceptual coding, idiosyncratic things, those just might be areas where you can't do voxel-to-voxel mapping, right? So there might be something about the data analytic method that in these particular areas lends you to find greater similarity and more abstract representations than perceptual ones.
I think I understand. Well, so we're not doing any functional alignment, if that is what you...
Anatomical alignment.
Yes, just anatomical alignment.
That's what I'm saying. So there's lots of variability, right? And so it might be the case that the representations that live in areas that can't be well aligned anatomically are qualitatively different than the representations that live.
So I totally agree. One way that could happen is just that the representations in those memory areas are spatially coarse. And that is something that we can align well, right? Certainly in these cross-subject comparisons, everything that we're measuring is spatially coarse because brains just don't align better than that, not at the voxel level, right?
Other questions?
Thanks for sharing this work, very nice. I have a question on the fact that you already mentioned you're using superstimuli, in a sense, and whether that constrains the scope of the inferences, because not only they pack a lot of information in a short time, but they're also designed to evoke similar responses, similar situation models across participants. So that's called box office success. Yeah. So in a sense, whether you inflate the estimation of the similarities between your observers or your recallers, because the nature of the material is such that evokes those similar patterns. That's what has been designed for through artistic intuition.
Yeah, I agree. So we do choose stimuli that synchronize people well, and we do have a little bit of a sense for what that's going to be. It has to be exciting. It's got to be not too hard to understand what's going on. And if you allow people to if you give people a stimulus that isn't so easy to interpret, you're definitely going to see less good inter-subject alignment. We haven't done the experiment where you give people a stimulus that doesn't align well, and then we ask for their memory of it. So that's an interesting one to do. You might actually expect that people would be even more similar to each other during recall if they're confused during the stimulus, but they are able to put together something by the end of it in order to report something coherent during memory. But yeah, we're currently in the stage where we still are trying to first establish that we have a strong signal during perception, and then in order to have a basis for saying something about recall.
Thanks.
That was a really beautiful and scarily technologically sophisticated talk for someone like me. So I want to ask about the temporal compression that you've found. And when I visualize all your participants and those different gradients, essentially different slopes, I'm kind of asking myself, are they all doing qualitatively the same thing but more of it? So imagine, literal compression. Or are some people, for example, abstracting to a higher level in their description, so they're describing gist that entails the different propositions? Or are they keeping at the propositional level but just missing out propositions? Okay. And so I wondered if you've done that analysis and whether that kind of analysis might actually help tidy up even more some of the transformations that you're seeing in the brain data.
So are you saying it is something that we think about, the difference between gist and temporal compression. So when we identify things as a summary, it is with gist in mind. So that is the kind of flavor of what people are reporting. But you're saying, is there a difference between gist-like statements and kind of statements where they really do tell you a lot of things, but just in short.
They could tell you a lot of things in short time, or they could just tell you every other thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We haven't done that analysis. The labeling that we're trying to do now is actually figuring out how much time is going into each sentence that people have. Right now we have the categories of summary and precise, but it's much more painstaking to go back and have somebody evaluate, was it a minute, was it 90 seconds, was it 45 seconds, but that's what we're doing. And your analysis is yet another one that we could do, where we say, is it really that they don't mention anything concrete in this sentence? It's really a broad summary, or did they say a lot of concrete stuff really quickly?
So great talk, and I really don't have anything to add in my talk. So thanks, which is no, but it was really good. And what I'm wondering is, we played around with hyper tools, and I got a little scared about looking at these trajectories, because I just wonder, you kind of alluded to this, but how much is lost when you vectorize people's language? Like, in other words, I wonder if somebody recalled Joe ate a hamburger, does it know the difference between that and the hamburger ate Joe?
I would say that the sentence level embedding does know the difference, but they're still quite poor tools. But they're amazing tools at the same time.
Yeah.
It was 5 years ago, or when they were invented, it was totally groundbreaking, and it continues to get better and better and better. So I think it's still far away from meeting the gold standard of human evaluation. But it's only improving. Another 5 years, and maybe it will be able to just write the paper for us.
Hi. So I'm thinking about theories like embodied cognition, that you should experience perhaps what you recall in sensory cortices. So the fact you don't find shared representations in sensory cortices, do you think that's because there aren't any? Or is it because you're chunking across time so that you're looking at scenes rather than the fine-grained sensory information?
Well, I'd say that what I think, I don't know if the data can actually differentiate these alternatives, but what I think is that what people are reporting is the plot. And so I don't think that they are doing a lot of sensory reactivation for this task, right? What we give them to do is tell it like you would tell it to a friend. And so they don't really have any need for re-visualizing the angle that people were facing or the color of their clothes or anything at that level. And we do see a lot of high-level visual cortex reactivation, but not lower than that. I was able to do the analysis in one subject where we actually had retinotopic mapping, and it goes down about like between pH C1 and 2, basically, is about how far it goes down. I do think that if you press people to do more visualization, you will be able to push that reactivation down further to the lower levels of the sensory hierarchy, but not in this task. I think
there was one more person.
Great talk, Janice. Yeah, so I really agree, and I love this recall similarity across people, because a lot of our work finds that people are really consistent in what they remember and forget, where they're not as consistent in how they might perceptually label some images. So people tend to remember and forget the same faces as each other, but they won't predict which ones they'd remember or forget with any consistency across people. And so I was wondering, have you looked at all what details people remember, and if there's consistency across people in terms of the details they recall, and if that their level of consistency maps onto their consistency in the brain, if that makes sense?
I would love to do that. Again, the bottleneck that we run up against is the things that we cannot automate. And though I do have quite a few RAs who are very, very patient at labeling this stuff, that's got to be one of our next things, but we haven't done it. No.
I second all the compliments you've received. There's lots, I'm not an imager, there's lots of yellow stuff, and all over the place. And what is it doing? I mean, do you guys have some hypotheses about what is actually being computed in those areas? So they correlate, great. But here's a skeptic, a Martian, has just come here, landed, and you're telling us the story. And I say, well, what's it to do with cognition?
Yeah. The yellow stuff is undifferentiated because if it matches in that same region in another person, it gets to be yellow, right? But of course, the representations are different in every part of the brain. And in the default network regions, I talked a little bit about the situation models, and I do think that that's what's going on there. If we take exactly the same stimulus, this is work by Yara Yesharut, you take exactly the same story, and you change what people think is happening by giving the characters a different relationship before they start listening to the story. You say, oh, those two people are actually having an affair. Those two people are jealous of each other. You can change patterns of activity in this region. And so it's not something that's intrinsic to the stimulus, it's the interpretation of the relationships between the entities in that story that's causing us to be able to decode. We can try to build models, encoding models of the brain activity patterns. So we go to, again, we label everything that we can think of. We just throw it all in. So we say, how many people are there? Is it inside or outside? Is there music? Is it high arousal? Is it negative or positive valence? And if we put everything we have into a model, we can classify about 75%, 70% over 50% chance level. But it's not a very good model. because so many things in a movie are confounded, you know? So when there's music, it's also very exciting. And when Sherlock is on the screen, a lot of stuff is happening, so a lot of things are confounded with him. I think that that is something that we just cannot escape from using stimuli like these, and that's why I say the majority approach should still be to try to pull things apart. So this is a hypothesis generation kind of approach, right? But to actually build that model of what is the thing. I think Charan might be talking about this in his talk. I'm not sure exactly what he's going to show, but he has done some experiments where you do try to swap out some of these elements and see if they play a key role in the activity patterns of these regions. Yeah.
Right, I think I understood that, but my question is, do you have some hypothesis about what these areas are doing? What are they contributing to me understanding that this young lady was flirting with this young man? I mean, what is it about that particular interpretation that is it represented all over those areas? It seems to be a disconnect between the beautiful stuff about being able to show these correlations and then saying something concrete about what is computed in those little areas. So if you look at them separately or together, I don't know how you want to do it, can you go back and that says something about what is being computed?
I mean, I guess I would say that I think that they carried the kind of minimal elements that are needed to describe that situation or scene. Maybe a description that you could give to another person. You know, you take all of the input from your many senses and distill it in levels through the brain, and at the top you have something which is like just enough for you to remember and recreate most of what you're going to need when you need to use that information later, either to tell somebody else or to predict what's going to happen when you encounter those same elements again, that configuration of elements. So I think that's about as close as I can get to an answer.
Thanks for a really great talk. I have actually two questions. One of them is a technical one, the other is a more conceptual one. So the technical one, I was just wondering, kind of following up from one of the previous questions, is it at all possible to use your sentence embedding on your descriptions and somehow quantify how similar or different descriptions are from each other? And use, say, for instance, multidimensional scaling on that and see if you find the same kind of patterning of your neural responses? Is that at all possible?
I think I did. So one of these is on the descriptions.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the part that's, so these on the right, this is the sentence embedding applied to the recall transcripts of people.
Right, okay.
This is what you mean, right?
Yeah, so is it actually the case that when you somehow use, say, multidimensional scaling or whatever kind of measure of similarity on these data, that you see similar clusters arise in your neural data as you see in your description data?
Yes and no. So that's, I just flew by it, but that's what you're seing on the bottom left here.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So you're seeing here is, like one of these is the clusters of the text annotation and one is the fMRI pattern. But I would say that this is not working very well yet, even though it actually looks pretty good. The stories are so separated in time that it's not really appropriate to try to do the clustering at this level because they're going to, time is a total confound here. If you can only accomplish this kind of alignment if you put a very, very long filter on the fMRI data. So I think that it's just not going to be the right data to do that,
right.
Except at a shorter time scale.
So the conceptual question was actually pertaining to your centrality measure. So your hypothesis was that when an event is more central, it should be easier to remember, but wouldn't the opposite also be a very valid hypothesis, that if something is actually very interlinked, that it becomes harder to actually recall that specific event, like you would see in, say, retroactive interference?
I think that's fair. I think that I would refine my description a little and say it's not that it's easier to remember, it's what people choose to report from their memory. So they are giving you a distilled account of the movie that they saw. And so those are kind of the anchor points of the story that in order to convey the meaning, the overall meaning to somebody else, that's what they'll choose to remember. Now, if we did this, so that's free recall. We are thinking about doing this as a recognition memory test, and I actually think the pattern of results would be pretty different.
So I really enjoyed your sort of meta thoughts about the, what you're studying at the end, your reflections there. But it brought up a question to me, which is, so we've established, I believe you that you're studying stories, and stories are important, evolutionarily, you can imagine. But do you think you're also studying perception in the real world? Like, to what extent do you think those two things are different, our story processing and our general processing of the world?
Like sensory perception?
Well, just how we're living right now and interacting with the world right now versus when you turn it into a story.
Yeah.
So how much do you think those are different?
I think that we narrativize as we go, if that is a little bit of what you're saying. So, you're remembering what happened in the last 10 minutes, and also in the last hour, and also in the last day. And you bring all of those things together, even if it's not consciously, they kind of influence the way that you take in new information. So I think that's my answer, is that I think that narrativization is like part of what this network is for. And I think that happens as you go. So it starts during encoding, and it also happens maybe in a more clarified manner when you are forced to actually report in an organized way what happened to you.
Thanks, really great talk, really liked it. So one question I had related to the really interesting findings about the sort of the retrieving, or like recalling it and then someone else hearing but not having seen the movie. We talked about this before. And at first I was really disturbed because I sort of thought, well, what about vision? It feels like it should contain, it should, I guess, have an impact greater than that. But then the more I thought about it, or at least how I sort of post hoc rationalized it, I thought, well, maybe is this something to do with the coarseness of the pattern that is like something sort of similar to what Sharon was saying is necessary for this inter-subject correlation, and as such in some world where we're able to more precisely align and maybe do a few other spatial things, perhaps in that case, we wouldn't see this kind of greater similarity or such a strong similarity between it having, between someone's explaining it and someone hearing it who hasn't seen it compared to when someone's seen it. I wonder if a lot of the detail, a lot of the like real visual, perceptual, specific, high granularity stuff is all at a higher spatial resolution. I just wonder.
I want to make clear, and I didn't have a map of this, but during perception, brains are very, very similar to each other, including in sensory cortices. That's the highest level of similarity will be found there. You're actually going to see similarity practically everywhere in the cortex during shared perception. So it's not that we're unable to find a match there, it's that it doesn't match between perception and recall.
Oh, sure. I guess I was just thinking that between the two recalls themselves, that alone, just the sort of the amount that was explained there is quite striking, given that they haven't seen the movie.
I think that that's right, that if we could do a better job of temporally aligning the movie and the recall within a person, maybe we could get further down into the even lower level visual areas, maybe. I mean, we can only go from the behavior that we have, and so even if we go word by word, you can only make as that good of a guess at what part of the movie they're actually thinking about when they say it. So, I mean, a grain at the sentence level is even, there's going to be some judgment involved, yeah.
Thanks.
Next question.
Hi. So, like many others, I really appreciate the kind of technological tour de force of doing these kinds of studies. In terms of the central question in cognition, as Alfonso was alluding to, if it's about similarity, correlation, and overlap, how could that not be true, right? I mean, that has to be the case because we understand each other. So then the question becomes, in terms of the brain data, what exactly are we learning from this? And as you pointed out, to call it a default system or a semantic system, I mean, doesn't get us anywhere. So I guess my question is, how do you start to unpack that? And one way, which we're actually doing in my lab, is to do a detailed content analysis of simple kinds of things, of like when people are talking about others versus when they're talking about places. And as proof of principle, showing that, oh yeah, if you do the content analysis, you can start now to see different domains, different largely distributed systems, but they are different. So have you thought about where you're going to go? I mean, there's a lot of questions. What's the role of the hippocampus in all of this? And on and on and on. But versus what we can say from those brain images, other than their similarity.
Yeah, the content analysis is the encoding model that I was referring to earlier. As I said, I don't think that we've done a very good job with it yet. The amount of data that's becoming publicly available is enormous. And you know, although it's not a very good answer necessarily to say we're going to throw more data at it, in this case it actually could help because you're going to collect more and more situations with these different movies and different stories where some of those variables become deconfounded. So I do think that content analysis is the way that you can start to answer the question of interest, like what are the functions and the roles that matter? What are the key elements of these scenes that actually matter to the brain pattern? So I guess I completely agree with you.
Oh.
Is there a question?
Yeah, get that first since you're in the neighborhood.
Over here. So I come from a vision background, and as you were talking, I was thinking a lot about the kind of history of visual neurophysiology, line drawings versus real images, and Hubel and Wiesel and their discovery of orientation tuning. And this will become relevant here because I think, in some sense, if we were only studying vision using line drawings, we would have begged the question of how it is that the representation of an image is encoded, because we're using the very thing that the brain has generated to make it possible to encode it, that is, the line drawing. And in this case, you're using the movie, which is, in some sense, the thing that has already, like, when you say a super stimulus, I take it one step further and say, well, it's the thing that some neural, like by consensus or development or whatever, we've chosen as the optimal way of representing it. But that's the thing I see this as trying to answer, which makes it kind of difficult to answer it if that's the only thing that you ever use, if that makes sense. So you could kind of back out into Alfonso and Alex's question and say, what's different about a movie versus like the rest of the world, and then what parts of that difference are these brain areas sensitive to, if that sort of makes some sense.
I like that analogy a lot. You know, we do a lot of our work with narratives as well, with auditory narratives and with text narratives. And you see basically the same kinds of stuff like non-visual cortex, but in the default network. You can take the same story and present it using visual depiction or with a text depiction. And that's part of the evidence, I think, that what's being represented in these areas is something like quite far away from the original perceptual details. But yeah, I take your point definitely that the movie stimulus or even the auditory narrative is already a kind of thing that people know that like is suited for what's happening in these regions. I mean, I don't know that like everybody knew that already, but it's what we're coming to think about it, that what's in a plot and what makes a story move and what makes it a story and not just like a collection of random stuff is the thing that really seems to be necessary for driving these regions. Yeah. Until we can actually put, you know, the scanner on somebody while they're out living their lives in the world, it's going to be hard to get closer to reality in the scanner. Yeah.
Jerry, last question.
So this is to follow up Alex's content point, and to an extent, I guess what I was thinking when Alfonso was asking, well, how could it be any other way? The thing I find so extraordinary is you're taking these scenes and you're just smushing them into one thing, okay? And so it's remarkable that one sees anything at all when you do that. And then I started to think, well, what is preserved when I actually smash stuff together if I'm actually observing a scene? And I'm just thinking of, could there be some low-level other explanation about what the content is that you're actually tracking here? So I'm just guessing, and you'll probably be able to rule this out straight away. I'm just guessing that if one were to smush all the pixels together and just superimpose, your protagonist is going to be moving around within the scene, but the background is still there, and that what you're actually seeing is reinstatement of the episodic context rather than reinstatement of the central character, maybe. So in other words, the content question is a really important one. It's about, can you in this method distinguish whether we're tracking figure or ground in this technique?
But in that scene, even if the character is moving around on the screen, he's still there, right?
But it's just smeared. I mean, I'm just thinking, if I was, a low-level visual recognizer, I get this smeared stuff that is a big nothingness, but I've got clarity in the background, and that's. I mean, I'm just wondering what is it you're preserving when you're smushing the dynamic, delayed, bold response into a single average for an entire scene?
I agree that the setting and the location is one of the critical elements of what makes a scene what it is. But I still do think that the fact that even if a character is moving all over the place on the screen or on your retina, he's still there for the entire scene. We can tell the same story with no picture, and he's still there for the whole scene, and it's still the same pattern of activity. I keep coming back to that configuration of the context, the location, the agents, their relationship to each other, their goals, and the temporal contingencies or the temporal script of that event as being the thing that is stable across the whole scene and in fact defines what it is and what makes it different from the next one. I think it's stable.
Okay, we have to stop. Thanks, Janice. We'll take a break and we'll be back at 4:15.